Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike. You guys are rocking with me and Mike of Intellectual Corner. In today's episode, we are diving back into Tick. This is part 2, the main reason why Germany lost World War II, oil. And without further ado, we're just going to dive right into it. Let's roll.
Case-Blau and Stalingrad is Hitler's absolute last chance of winning the war. He even says, if I do not get the oil of Mayakop and Grozny, then I must end the war. And he was right. Fuel too was in such short supply that the Wehrmacht High Command in 1942 cut the fuel ration to the Oustheer considerably, a blow to its mobility accentuated by the serious loss of horses. The OKW warns in June of 1942 that the army will have no choice but to partially demotorise. Yes, demotorise. Those of you who say that the Germans didn't have enough tanks or trucks or equipment, you're half right. They actually did have enough tanks. Tank numbers were greater in 1942 than in 1941 and again in 1943 compared to 1942. The problem is that they don't have enough petrol to run the ones that they've got already. Tellingly, at a time when the Soviets were rapidly rebuilding and mechanising their forces, the Wehrmacht was in the process of re-equipping its reconnaissance units with bicycles. This demodernisation of the Oustheer did not bode well, given that the success of the campaign depending on seizing objectives more than 800 miles from the German start line.
Yeah, so pretty much they're literally having to freaking, like he's saying, they're literally having to go from World War II tactics back to World War I tactics, back to, saying Napoleonic tactics, but they're having to do all this because they can't keep their modernized industry and their modernized war economy and weapons and stuff going, because they don't have the stuff to keep it moving. They don't have oil, they don't have, like you said, they probably do have manpower, but again, they probably, who knows, they probably don't have the manpower to keep all those. At a certain point, they probably do start losing more manpower and stuff like that, because at a certain point that those bodies start to add up. So let's keep going.
Start line, an operational and logistic challenge greater than that of the previous summer. A lot of people, including historians, say that the Germans were aiming for Baku. The Germans don't actually need to take Baku, they just need to take Mayakop and Grozny, and technically they do get to them, but they only managed to extract 750 tonnes of crude oil from them per month before they're forced back. But this is Hitler's last chance. He's now at war with Britain and the Soviet Union, which is bad enough as it is, but he's also now at war with the United States, the leading oil power of the world. America's trucks, tanks, planes, trains. They sent a lot of trains to the Soviet Union, which may have been more important than the trucks they sent. And vast quantities of other equipment, well, they're on their way. And unlike the Germans, the Allies have the fuel to run them. It's just a matter of time. Hitler knows this, and knows his only chance to fight against the material superiority that's heading his way is to capture the oil in the Caucasus. If he gets the oil, his economy will be saved, and he would have the resources of continental Europe at his disposal. He would have the fuel to motorise and mechanise his army, and the panzers would have the fuel they need to actually fight. The Blitzkrieg would be back on, but he only has a narrow window of opportunity to take the oil. This is why it was vitally important that the Caucasus be taken in 1942, and why the Stalingrad campaign is important too. There's two aspects to this plan of Hitler's as well. The first is to get the oil at Mayakop and Grozny. The second is to cut the Soviets off from Baku. And now he can't get to Baku, but what he can do is block the Volga. Perhaps they shouldn't have gone into the city of Stalingrad, but sat south of it on the Volga and just prevented the oil tankers from heading north. And, well, we'll leave the tactical decisions behind this debate for another day. But if the Germans cut the Volga, the Soviet Union...
But I mean, even if they did that, they still would have had to have, did they have, because I'm not 100% sure, did they have the air superiority at the time to be able to do that? Because, that's asking a lot to just essentially set up camp on a river, and you know what I'm saying, like I don't know how, you know, the covering is or over there, like if there's a whole bunch of trees and stuff like that, but even then, like what can trees do to it for a bomb and stuff like that? So you know.
Cut the Volga, the Soviet Union would be crippled. The loss of the Caucasus would deprive the Soviet Union of half of its oil reserves and 80 to 90% of its crude oil production, refinery output and pipeline capacity. Meanwhile, severing the transit lines along the Volga would eliminate the most effective means of moving oil to central Russia from either the Caucasus, covering a distance of 1,200 kilometers on average to reach its domestic consumers, or the Volga Urals, the second Baku. Without oil and without food, and by the way, the Soviets were getting hungry already thanks to the loss of the Ukraine, the Soviet war effort would be in a dire situation. This would have given Hitler the oil he needed to keep fighting and deprive the Soviets of the oil and food they needed to fight effectively. Germany would have been placed in the best position, the best chance of winning, if they'd taken the Caucasus and cut the Volga. This was Hitler's last real gamble. This is why the Stalingrad campaign is a turning point. It may not be the big turning point of the war. Arguably, that may have already happened, and we'll ask that question, you know, what was the big turning point of the war, in another video. But if Hitler had won this fight in 1942, it's likely that the Soviets would have collapsed in 1943-1944. German economic assessments of the Soviet Union's precarious economic situation in early 1942 also had some merit. The Soviet economy was in fact on the verge of collapse due to the loss of numerous economic and raw materials assets during Operation Barbarossa. Moreover, the Soviet Union was already dependent by 1942 on Lend-Lease assistance, especially food and specialty petroleum products such as high-octane gasoline. Consequently, there is every reason to think that the loss of the Caucasus would have rendered the Red Army combat ineffective within a year. Cutting the oil route north would mean that the Red Army would barely have enough reserves of oil to wage war in 1943 and probably would have paralysed what remained of Soviet agriculture production. And Stalin knows this as well. He tells Deputy Oil Commissar Nikolai Beerpikov that if he doesn't destroy the oil fields before the Germans capture them, he would be shot. The Soviets therefore ensure that the oil fields are destroyed, so thoroughly in fact that even the Germans were impressed by the effort they went to do it. The issue with the 1942 campaign was that, well, it's of distance. The Germans simply don't have enough men and equipment to do the task. I'll be covering this in great detail in my upcoming Stalingrad documentary, but effectively, the Germans and Axis allied forces are not capable of what was needed, and they are defeated. When you read the accounts of German panzer formations advancing in this campaign, you hear how they keep running out of fuel. This means their attack on Stalingrad, for example, is often a stop-start affair, as they're waiting for more fuel to catch up to them. Yes, logistics does play its part, but actually a lot of it is simply the fact that the Germans have run out of fuel. Now, some of you will be thinking that Germany carried on the war until 1945 and that its economy didn't collapse because of a lack of oil resulting from not capturing the Caucasus. This is true, but that doesn't mean they weren't chronically short of oil. Synthetic fuel.
I mean, technically getting the fuel to them is a part of the logistics, so I mean, you know what I'm saying, like they failed on that whole aspect, period. So I mean, you know what I'm saying, there's nothing that they can do. And just the fact that they're dealing with this huge, like, you know what I'm saying, humongous freaking battlefront, that they had to try to get oil to every single point of that battlefront, like it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't, not realistic.
Short of oil. Synthetic fuel allowed Germany to wage war but not to win it. Germany's economically illiterate generals scoffed at economic advisors who urged the conquest of the Caucasus by pointing out that Germany managed to carry on the war until 1945 without ever securing the Caucasus oil. But at no point after the failures of 1941-42 did Germany ever possess the opportunity to end the war on favourable terms. Rather, Axis Europe had to spend the rest of the conflict labouring under constant shortage of energy, which constrained economic productivity and reduced military effectiveness. Hayward also points out that the German economy didn't collapse, and that even some of the economic reports about the lack of oil were a little bit exaggerated. However, there are reasons the Germans continue to fight. Italy defected to the Allies, so the Germans captured Italian oil reserves. They also ramped up synthetic oil production, which helped massively, although was never going to be enough. They're also fighting a mostly defensive war at this point, so fuel isn't getting used as much. There's also a reduction in the number of fighting vehicles. Some Luftwaffe training regimes were closed because of a lack of fuel, and the Luftwaffe as a whole was suffering from a chronic lack of fuel. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were relying on capturing Allied fuel stocks, and Piper even drove half-tracks through minefields to clear them because, well, they'd run out of fuel. The weapons of war are useless when you don't have the fuel to run them, which is why it was a sound strategy to drive half-tracks over mines. And there's other examples, but essentially the economy didn't collapse until the US Air Force hammered the synthetic oil plants in late 1940.
Yeah, and at this point, you know what I'm saying, you're adding all these fuel things to their list. Like their morale is already, you know what I'm saying, at rock bottom. So you're adding on to the fact that they're trying to always do this for a war that they're probably already done fighting. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm surprised they didn't essentially quit faster. But
before 1945. And this whole oil crisis explains some of the other aspects of the war, including Hitler's stand-fast orders. People don't seem to understand Hitler's stand-fast orders. His generals were the most vocal on this subject, even going so far as to call him mad. That argument is convincing from a tactical point of view, but not from a strategic point of view. Hitler says he either takes Mayerkop and Grozny or must end the war. And so he takes them and then holds on to them for dear life, hoping to simultaneously extract oil and starve the Soviets of oil. Where does he starve them of oil? The Volga at Stalingrad. Now, it can be argued that Stalingrad wasn't necessary for this. They could have gone south of the city and blocked the Volga there, and I agree. However, once committed at Stalingrad, Hitler's reasoning for standing fast on the Volga is kind of understandable. Not just from a tactical point of view, but from a strategic point of view. He's trying to block the oil shipments up the Volga. And not withdrawing from the Caucasus makes sense because he's trying to extract the oil. There's also the promise from Manstein, who says he'll link up with the 6th Army, and then there's also Jesenek's indication that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air. Anyway, it turns out to be a complete disaster, as we know.
yeah, essentially all of his different generals are essentially, he's already set for this because he knows that this is what they need. But his generals are all around him, letting him know, hey, yeah, you're good. I promise you, we got you. We're gonna get this, And so obviously, in his mind, he's thinking, okay, so go do it then, pretty much, So
To be a complete disaster, as we know. After this, though, why stand fast? Well, let's not forget who Hitler was. He had fought in the First World War, and so he does not want to repeat the stab-in-the-back surrender that caused the Germans to lose World War I. After World War I, the German opinion was that the German army had not been defeated in the field, and had in fact been stabbed in the back by the government. Hitler, having lived through that war, and having shared this opinion most vocally, is not willing to surrender in this second war for this reason. And in 1943 and 1944, the Germans are still fighting deep in Soviet territory. They are weak, but far from defeated. But now they have this critical oil crisis.
Yeah, they freaking hold up into those Caucasus Mountains until damn near the last few months of the war. They were stuck in there pretty damn good. So I think right on the edge of the coast too. So
that prevents the movement of their motorised units. The German generals are suggesting that they should just move back in order to consolidate and then buy time for another counterattack. They're saying that they want to fight a manoeuvre war, and that's perfectly understandable. However, they are thinking from a tactical and operational point of view, not a strategic point of view. Their fuel supplies are inadequate. They can't fight the maneuver war that they want to. When you look at what Hitler's saying, I shouldn't have listened to my generals, he's right. They wanted to go to Moscow, they wanted Leningrad, they wanted to retreat. They were wrong. Generals like Manstein are relieved of command and replaced by generals who will stand and fight. About his dismissal, Manstein says that Hitler still had faith in him, but at the moment, however, there was no further scope for me in the east. The task now pending, he considered Model, who had stopped a difficult retreat in Northern Army Group, to be especially suitable. He goes on to say about the Army Group command he was handing over to Model. Its only remaining commitment was to assist the fighting troops and give them moral support. That Model would certainly be able to do. The Führer empathically agreed that Model was a particularly suitable choice in this respect, as he would dash around the divisions and get the very most out of the troops. Manstein was the old manoeuvre warfare general, whereas Model was the type of defensive general who would stand and fight to the last. This is why Model was known as the Führer's fireman, because he was constantly putting out fires throughout the Eastern Front. The point being that there was no fuel left to wage the manoeuvre war that Manstein was good at, and that the war had moved to an attritional defensive battle stage. Hitler recognised that, and he also couldn't surrender, as stated. So, really, what choice does he have other than to stand and fight? He's playing for time, because that's all he's got left, and he's hoping for miracles. That's not the thoughts of a madman. This is his only option. If he surrenders, he's dead. So he has to keep fighting.
Really, it's his own fault. Like, his own ideology put himself between a rock and a hard place, because, I mean, in my mind, you know what I'm saying? Like, again, we saw in the 30s, we saw Stalin giving Hitler gifts and stuff like that, and congratulating him for conquering so much out in the West. So, like, you know what I'm saying? And again, he also didn't trust him for as far as he could throw him. But who's to say that, you know, he wouldn't be willing to work with Hitler or, you know, or the Germans to help them with their oil to stop Britain, and then Hitler can ramp back up and then go back out east and stuff like that. But again, I understand it's like I said, it's his own ideology that gets in his way throughout this entire conflict, in my opinion. But I mean, what do you expect?
So he has to keep fighting. Given the situation strategically, this is his only option, and he's not mad for taking it. He's desperate and he's clutching at straws, but he's not mad. The oil crisis dictates that this has to happen. I also think it's interesting that up until late 1942, Hitler is mostly willing to listen to his generals and mostly willing to allow them to do what they think's best. Stalin is the opposite of this, and yet during the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin and Hitler seem to swap personalities. Hitler becomes less willing to listen to his generals and less willing to allow them the freedom of action they want. Stalin does start listening to his generals and does start allowing them to make their own decisions. It's as though both dictators realised at the same time that the tide had changed, that Hitler had lost the war and Stalin had won it. And it isn't just because of the fall of the Ukraine and the food or the coal or the other aspects. And it's not because the Wehrmacht was defeated. It was because Hitler had not taken the oil and not won the oil rush. And he had spent his last energies trying to get there.
Yeah, pretty much he knew that specific date that we already knew from the first video had already passed, and obviously from what we know, that video had passed, or that month had passed, like what, freaking obviously like a year to 2 years by this point. So you know what I'm saying, it's been done. Not to mention Hitler's already over here losing more men already out here in the east, and combined with any of the men that he's lost in the West. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's just insane to think about.
Once this is realised, both seem to swap roles. And that to me is very interesting. There's obviously a lot of factors going on here, but That change of personality indicates that the tide of war had changed. Now, of course, Hitler had been stubborn before this, and sometimes his decisions don't seem to make much sense on the surface, such as Dunkirk. Why allow the British to withdraw from Dunkirk? Now, I'm going to hold my hand up in here and just say that I'm only suggesting that this is a fact.
And again, like I said in the beginning of the first video, we already know that it wasn't his, it's not something that he actually really wanted to do. It's something he had to do because and you know, he might say something different if he does, and obviously I'll put my foot in my mouth, but I'm pretty sure it's because the tanks and all those for the Blitzkrieg they were too fast. Pretty much the infantry couldn't catch up, they couldn't keep up, and pretty much he had to halt the entire front army that was really, you know, essentially right outside of the area, and he had to halt them so that the rest of the army could actually get there, because you can't really do a proper blitzkrieg without the infantry and stuff like that. So, you know what I'm saying?
And I'm not saying this is the absolute 100% the only reason for this. I'm only suggesting that this should be factored in to the debate about Dunkirk. Okay, I'm going to suggest that some of the historians who say that Hitler did it for political reasons because he is trying to appease Britain may have been right. Why would he try and appease Britain? Britain, by fighting on, is no real threat to Germany, at least not by itself. Its army is small, they're struggling in North Africa against the Italians, and then later Rommel and his 3 divisions, and its air force is good, but not able to seriously hurt Germany at this time. But what the British have is the Royal Navy, and Hitler knows what they'll do with it. Blockade. Just like they do in the First World War, Germany is blockaded. Shipments of oil from the United States and Venezuela cease, and this is the ticking time bomb for Germany. This limits Germany's potential to win the war, resulting in the invasion of the Soviet Union. But if Hitler can appease the British or persuade them to come to peace, it would allow shipments of oil to keep coming into Germany and maybe buy him time to turn his army into a fully motorised and mechanised force. In this context, Dunkirk makes sense. Let's allow the British to withdraw, showing Britain that, hey, we don't want to fight you, let's go for peace, eh? This is Hitler trying to win the British over. But, of course, Churchill has none of it. Okay, fine, so let's threaten to invade and then put political and economic pressure on Westminster to peace out by bombing them and then sink their ships. Hitler doesn't need a victory, he just needs...
But when it comes to that, though, wasn't Hitler pretty confident in his U-boats and stuff like that? And during the early stages of the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic, wasn't it they were the U-boats were going crazy on British boats and stuff like that, to the point where a lot of them were they just couldn't get it figured out until they got that code figured out. You know what I'm saying? From the code machine. If I'm not mistaken, wasn't that the whole thing? He was just fine with, I don't know, maybe, but again, maybe I feel like these are just, like he said, these are factors. You know what I'm saying? There's multiple factors in this, but you know, let's keep going.
Victory, he just needs peace. Goebbels says he doesn't want at all to annihilate England nor destroy its empire, but we must have calm. Kershaw says while he was at the Berghof, Hitler had talks with his military leaders about a possible invasion of Britain should his peace offer be rejected. At these discussions, an invasion was still seen as a last choice rather than a first option. As Richard Overy states, he was forced to attack the Soviet Union because Britain's stupid chiefs refused to make a sensible peace. Perhaps, he reflected, he should have struck south, seized Gibraltar, and swept into the Near East to smash British resistance. Dunkirk, in this context, makes sense. Allow the British army to withdraw. It's not really a threat anyway.
And also, too, when it comes to the British or him not wanting to, not wanting to not wanting to essentially annihilate Britain and stuff like that, and wanting to go for peace first, is because of the fact that he never wanted to have war with France or Britain in the first place. Well, maybe France, because, you know, he had a personal grudge for France, but for Britain, he never really wanted to go to war with them in the first place. He just knew that it was inevitable because of their treaty with Poland, and there was nothing that he could really do about that. But, and if I'm not mistaken, he still viewed the, you know, Britain or Great Britain, or, you know what I'm saying, UK, as, you know, distant cousins, just for the fact of the Anglo-Saxons and all that stuff. So that's what I'm saying. Like he actually, and if I'm not mistaken, he actually, like, he respected and kind of actually admired their empire, and wanted to kind of grow the German empire to be a rival, if not even bigger than theirs, obviously. So, but yeah.
British resistance. Dunkirk, in this context, makes sense. Allow the British army to withdraw. It's not really a threat anyway, and we don't really want to invade England. And then try and get the British to accept peace. Perhaps this is why Hitler stopped the panzers. If the British can be persuaded to come to terms on the peace table, the blockade will be lifted and Germany will have access to more oil. Maybe this was for economic reasons. In his biography of Hitler, Kershaw suggests that this wasn't the case, and that Dunkirk was in fact a purely military decision. In Schirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, he has a debate about it, citing our beloved Halder over and over again, and seems puzzled when some generals suggest that Hitler was happy to let the British Empire live on. Halder, of course, says Hitler was at fault, and that it was his military decision, although admits that there were second political decisions and reasons as well. Halder blames Goering, sides with Rundstedt, who says he wasn't the one who sided with Hitler, even though he did, and there's other generals as well that seem to be on Hitler's side in one account and then not in another, and it's a whole... The debate goes on, it's a massive mess. And really, it does deserve a video on its own, but I'm going to suggest that Hitler had the oil situation in the back of his mind as well. And in that context, it adds weight to the idea that Hitler was trying to appease the British. In that sense, he does not need victory, he just needs peace. Again, I'm just suggesting that this was a factor, not necessarily the only factor.
Yeah, and as I just said, I'm pretty sure if anything, it was just one of many multiple factors. Because, I mean, that's just throughout history, you know what I'm saying? Almost every single historical event that you will ever come across as a historian or just a lover of history, there are multiple events and things that have to do with that event. Nothing is ever black and white. If you think that, you know what I'm saying, you're not digging hard enough, in my opinion. But, you know,
right or wrong though, I would love to hear your thoughts on this point, so let me know. 90% of the world oil supplies were controlled by the Allies. So deficient were the Axis powers of oil, they were willing to wage war to obtain it. This was the Axis Achilles heel. The British decision to keep fighting in 1940 results in a blockade of Europe that prevents oil from getting to Germany. Hitler is therefore forced to fight a war with the Soviet Union, which doesn't collapse in 1941 as expected, but keeps fighting. This forces Hitler to gamble in striking towards the Caucasus in 1942 in one last attempt to get to the oil that he needs to wage the war, and is prevented from doing so by what happens at Stalingrad. After this point, Hitler's only real choice is to fight, and buy him as much time as possible, leading to an increasing use of stand-fast orders. Ultimately, Germany didn't need more panzers or trucks or submarines or planes because it couldn't run the ones it had. Oil is probably not the only factor, but it is a big one. When you think of World War II, you should think of oil. It explains the war, it explains why one side won and one side lost, it explains the post-war world, why Britain is no longer a superpower, but the Soviets and the USA are, and it explains many of the decisions made at the time and even since. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know below. And if this makes sense to you, share this video. Tell people, hey, this is why Germany lost the war. Thank you to my patrons for making this video possible. Your support allowed the purchase of the books I used in this video. You effectively made this video happen, so thank you for being awesome. Big shout out and a big thank you goes to Richard Stokes, who provided me with several articles from authors like Toprani, the guy doing a substantial amount of research on the oil situation in World War II. As a follow-up video to this video, I highly recommend the lecture video by Toprani.
Alright guys, we'll go ahead and end it right there. So yeah, I mean, as we can pretty much see, like, you know what I'm saying, this stuff, it's never black and white. It's never, especially with World War II, holy crap, you know what I'm saying, World War II has to be the most, you know what I'm saying, non-black and white thing I've ever, like, tried to learn. Like, if you think one thing is, like, you know what I'm saying, like with Dunkirk, you think he stopped his troops for this reason, well guess what, it's probably for like 7 different other reasons. So always keep that in mind though whenever learning throughout history. And with that being said, if you guys liked the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you guys on the next one. I'm out.